Greetings. I'm Dr. Aldrich Chan, neuropsychologist and psychotherapist in Miami, faculty at Pepperdine University, and the founder of the Center for Neuropsychology and Consciousness. Welcome to the CNC Dialogues. Today's guest is Dr. Stephen Hayes. He's a Nevada Foundation professor at the Department of Psychology at the University of Nevada. He's best known for developing relational frame theory and guiding its extension to acceptance and commitment-based therapy, ACT, a popular evidence-based form of therapy that uses mindfulness, acceptance, and value-based methods. He's the author of 47 books and over 675 scientific articles. His career has focused on the analysis of the nature of human language and cognition and the application of this to the understanding and alleviation of human suffering. Dr. Hayes has been president of APA Division 25, or the Applied and Preventive Psychology Division, as well as president of the Association for Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies and the Association for Contextual Behavioral Science. Google Scholar data ranks him among the top 935 highest impact living scholars worldwide in all areas of study, and Research.com lists him as the 63rd highest impact psychologist in the world. In today's discussion, we take a deep dive into the foundations of ACT and subsequently new developments such as its integration into process-based therapy and the extended evolutionary meta-model. We then explore some of its core sub-processes such as diffusion, acceptance, and values. We further discuss their relationship with trauma and addictions. Many other topics are talked about throughout before ending on rapid-fire questions, providing a new angle onto who Stephen Hayes is as a person. Feel free to skip around if any of these topics speak to you. So let me first congratulate you on 1,000 randomized controlled trials. I mean, that's quite an accomplishment. Your baby has grown into an adolescent, right? So,
Yeah, at least, on those metrics. Actually, it's up to around 1,200 right now, and we have another 150 to drop from China and places where it's really hard for us to fully get the descriptions in because sometimes, we're trying to translate it from Chinese and things like that. But yeah, it's one every 2 or 3 days. There's a new randomized trial.
Okay. Well, great timing then for this to have you on today, especially given this milestone, even though you've already blown past it. And, while most therapists are, again, at least superficially familiar with psychological flexibility and the 6 core sub-processes, or 12 if we include psychological inflexibility, right? I think where people fall short are the foundational pillars, which provides the context for which ACT is situated. So I'd like us to touch on a few of these. And the first one I wanted to talk about is relational frame theory. Could you give us a definition of it? What is it and how does it relate to ACT in practice?
Well, relational frame theory is the underlying model of language and cognition, but it's not just a model like an idea or something. It's an active research program. And the reason it's there is, I was frustrated with the idea that we would be doing evidence-based therapy without having principles in the lab that were fully informing it. And I'm old enough to have been there when there wasn't a cognitive behavior therapy. It was just behavior therapy. And the principles in behavior therapy were largely done from non-human animals and then from social learning processes, modeling, and things like that. When we got to cognition, which needed to happen, there wasn't such a thing. There really wasn't. And if you think of hard cognitive science, no, number one, that evolves later. Number two, it never did really play very nice with therapy. It's really been a hard go for that. And so I wanted a theory of cognition that was more like reinforcement, stimulus control, things like that when you're dealing with non-human animals. And we arrived at one that is very robust, working very, very well. And if you're trying to do things like help children learn language if they're not neurotypical, or if they haven't developed a sense of self, or if you want to increase your intelligence and really push your own cognitive abilities, it's a pretty cool thing. A little geeky, but there's actually a ditty that summarizes it, which is learn it in 1, derive it in 2, put it in networks that change what you do. That's 40 years of work and 4 lines of ditty. And basically what RFT has discovered and constructed is that we are the social primates who learned to treat a relationship between events and what you say or how you react to it in a bidirectional way, that you could learn it in one direction, drive it in two. What do I mean by that? Well, the social primates that we are, even before we fully develop language, since we are so cooperative and understood something through basic theory of mind skills, even before language fully evolves, which your infants can show.
Mm-hmm.
And to some degree, primates have some of these skills. If you were to give a name to an object, which many, many animals do, and then say the name, the same parts of the brain that are involved in the CNC relationship will be involved in deriving a hear and do relationship. Imagine a tribe of hominins, probably goes back before Homo sapiens, where you would say something like apple across a ravine, but you're not actually languaging creatures the way you and I are doing right now. We're not symbolically reasoning and so forth. Well, your trope mates might hear that word apple, orient towards apples, and bring you one back. That's what I mean by learn it in one, derive it in two. That in infants, even human infants, at 6 months, if you hold up an object and give it a name and then say the name, they don't look for the object. But just a little bit later, when you get them around 12 months old, they do. Mm-hmm. And if they don't, they're not going to be able to develop normal language function. Mm-hmm. And then once that's going, once you have kind of a relation of same, this is, babies start deriving what is based on what isn't. Mm-hmm. So if you said metronome, baby would look around and maybe see an unfamiliar object. And if it saw a metronome, you might then be able to say, where's the metronome? And the baby would find it. So this language explosion, if you've ever had kids where it just goes boom, you start out with this idea that words are names can be things, and then you go into there's a relation of difference. Pretty soon after that, you can say things, and you're going to be, we're going to have a conversation when Dad gets home, and you'll understand that. Or what did you have for breakfast? And then what did your sister have for breakfast? So you'd understand perspective taking. So time, causality, bigger than. Want a concrete example, and then I will land the plane in terms of why this matters. Young children, if you give them a choice between a nickel and a dime, they take the nickel every single time. And then they hit a point, around age 4, they want the dime. It's bigger. Well, it's not bigger. Dime's smaller. And that idea, when it gets fully into the brains that you and I have, you can have things like you can be a billionaire and ask you what do you want? And it would seem reasonable to have an answer. This was in the movie about that robber baron a while back. This billionaire says, what do I need to be happy? More. Conversely, you could have a wonderful life, but it's not as big as it should be, or if it's so because it becomes arbitrary. The dime is arbitrarily said to be bigger than. So the core of relational frame theory is that we learn relations, and once we do that, it actually reflects back on us. And at the point at which we can take the perspective of others, we can step outside your own skin and look back at ourselves, which is a really important point in human consciousness, where there's almost a break. And in some of our religious traditions, you now can be held responsible for your behavior, whereas before that you couldn't. And you can do things like make yourself miserable in the midst of plenty. You can have everything you need that a dog or a cat or every other creature on the planet needs to be happy, and you're miserable because it's not good enough, or whatever the story is that's in your head. So what's inside ACT is a real caution about using language in a simple problem-solving way, and a deep interest in how to rein in that part of us, so that part of us that are deeper. I mean, after all, most of your brain and the way you interact with the world evolved many millions of years earlier, before human language evolved. Being able to take advantage of your gut sense, your experience, that felt emotion, intuition, we have words for it. Bring the whole of you to the choices that you make. But that can only happen when you rein in the analytic judgmental mind.
Mm.
And methods like mindfulness training and so forth are designed to do that and act as part of those traditions. So that's about the shortest I can do with RFT. You started off with one of the hardest questions there is.
Yeah. Is
And
it?
you've got to be kind of geeky to really dive into it and fully understand it. But I hope people can just get a grasp of it from learn it in one, derive it in two, put it in networks. They all combine to change what you do.
Yeah, Steve, could I say that when it comes to relational frame theory, that complexity of our mind brains increase with the complexity of relationships. And as relationships get more complex, so does it exist in different dimensions as well, such
Right.
as an idea with myself, an idea from the viewpoint of another person, from an external party, and so forth and so on. And through those relationships, we continue to evolve, linking two or more bits of information in varying dimensions that allows us to express ourselves symbolically the way that we do today.
Well, and what I just did in terms of an appeal to the cooperative species that we are is forming the ground for evolving cognition the way we
Mm-hmm.
mean it now in terms of symbolic learning systems
Mm-hmm.
comports with that. But I pushed it even a little farther that the social brain hypothesis I think is pretty cool, but I think there's another step forward. It's the cultural brain hypothesis,
Mm-hmm.
because it isn't just that you're able to take the perspective of others and keep track of a larger group, which is very important for a social primate as social as we are. We're 100 times more cooperative, for example, than chimpanzees, our closest relative. Um, we're also able to modify what we do based on the agreed upon practices of that group.
Mm-hmm.
And that's another level up that gave us an evolutionary advantage even before symbolic language really got going. But as it gets going now, it's a kind of a cork out of the bottle thing where you're driving the brain size. Despite the fact that this is life-threatening now for having birth of babies with heads that big,
Mm-hmm.
a significant portion of the mothers die in doing that. If we're doing a really high intensity thing, even what we're doing right now, we're probably consuming 15-20% of all of our calories
Mm-hmm.
inside a really small part of our body in our skull.
Mm-hmm.
This is a wasteful thing evolutionarily unless it really pays off.
Right.
I don't think the way it pays off, it isn't just that you're part of a larger and larger group. It's that the practices of those groups are informing your day-to-day interactions with the world in
Mm-hmm.
ways that make you more effective.
Mm-hmm.
And then once you're there, competition between groups itself becomes an evolutionary force. It isn't just your survival, it's your band, your family, your troops' survival.
Mm-hmm.
And that cooperation, I think, has driven human development.
Right. That's
Now also
fascinating.
has to be reined in, by the way, because tribal ways of thinking about things have to evolve into a whole world ethic, because we're now dealing with systems where we're all involved. Somebody
Yeah.
trashes the planet, we all suffer. If somebody drops nukes, we're all in trouble. So the group has expanded,
Mm-hmm.
and our cultural influences have expanded through
Right.
tech and what we're doing right now.
Yeah, I think it's a good thing that the field is moving towards multiple levels of consideration and complexity. It doesn't seem to only appear to happen at the individualistic level, but also from Sloan Wilson's work on multi-level selection at that genetic level. It seems to be quite interesting that we're finding these that the olden ways of thinking are no longer sufficient to explain how humanity has evolved to the extent that we have.
Well, and the deep wisdom of MLS and multi-level selection, and David's a
Mm-hmm.
colleague. We've written multiple books together and so forth. He's really almost my third mentor in my life, because some years ago, about 12, 15 years ago, I basically nominated him as my mentor, and he allowed me to train with him essentially by giving me the readings I needed to understand modern evolutionary theory.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the deep lessons of MLS, multi-level selection, is that selection at any one level needs to be looked at in terms of selection at a higher level of complexity, and things that work at one level can really undermine the functioning at the higher level.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can't understand the whole of us without embedding different levels of complexity. You're a multicellular organism. If
Mm-hmm.
one cell decides to be selfish, you've got cancer. If it just says, I want more of me, well, you're in trouble. And of course, you have massive systems to detect that, to kill the cell if it can do it, to correct the reading of DNA if it can be done. In the same way, what we're doing now inside the ACT world with our focus on processes of change, which goes even a little beyond the liberated mind, which was only written a few years ago,
Mm-hmm.
is realizing that a lot of our assumptions about how things that are psychological scale to the social level are wrong. I can give you a quick example. If you're kind and compassionate to yourself, you'll be kind and compassionate to others. Most people believe that. Almost every study shows that. If you do it properly, and we can get into what properly means, with the new statistics that we're developing that really allow you to model what's happening, about 1 out of 8, 1 out of 10 people, the nicer they are themselves, the meaner and nastier they are to others. And while the stats say no, it's because the stats are wrong, and everybody knows it because you all know somebody who's a selfish, self-compassion person.
Right.
You take care of the kids, I go meditate. Self-care, I need my self-care. Dude, yeah, I get that. Self-compassion.
That is an interesting phenomena that not only myself but others have encountered. That some people are fearful of the mindfulness community because they feel like lots of individuals in the mindfulness community can actually be quite cruel to others, even though they preach mindfulness and compassion and so forth.
Well, that's an empirical fact, and I can show you the data on it. And now that we have to know how to look for it. If you just put in the normal statistics, it'll hide it because the variation between people is the metric instead of variation within persons, which is where selfishness really resides. That's a larger, geekier conversation, but an important one. But I came to that early on, and it's one of the things that is characteristic of ACT development, which is we have systematically avoided any way for gurus to control the behavior of the group that is evolving acceptance and commitment therapy or acceptance and commitment training, or beyond that, what we call contextual behavioral science, which includes DBT and CFT and a lot of these other third wave methods of evidence-based CBT. And it's because I'll show you the scars on my back later of realizing that these gurus had feet of clay. I lived for a while on a commune with a guy who was wearing the orange robes of a swami and swearing, making chastity vows. And I was there literally sitting in the room when one woman started crying about having led the master astray. And so, every woman in the room is going, I thought I led the master astray. And so Swami Kriyananda, he almost lost his thing. He did it twice, actually. The old coot did it 15 years later, same exact thing. But, Joshu Sasaki Roshi, one of the biggest Zen masters in the world, came to Japan. I saw him right after, just in a month or so after he came off his journey from Japan to LA. Go and read the wiki page. He's 100 years old and he's trying to nail his acolytes. So here's my point on that. Don't be thinking that just because you're working on things like compassion and mindfulness and so forth that you get a pass,
right?
Or that the people you look up to get a pass on the possibility that at a higher level, selfishness at that social level can emerge. And put in checks and balances to make sure that doesn't happen.
Right.
If you're doing mindfulness training with someone, or you're trying to learn it, or you're, a little bit of healthy skepticism is good. Yeah, that person running the workshop may really look awesome, and the things they're saying are so wise. Take the teachings, but to apply them in a way that doesn't allow you to become insensitive and be cautious, I think. Because the
Mm-hmm.
history of gurudom is everywhere, and it's ugly.
Mm-hmm. Sounds like there's perhaps there already is a paper to be written called The Dark Side of Mindfulness in relationship to all of these. I'd love to see those papers. But Steve, I want to move us forward because I want to
Yeah,
get
sure. Yeah, we're having a
some
fun conversation over the odd corner. Hopefully, we're serving at least a few people.
yeah. So the next pillar I wanted to touch on is functional contextualism. I
Yeah.
wonder if you could dive into that for us.
Boy, you're doing wonderful and hard questions. But what contextualism is, look here, your deep philosophical assumptions color what you do so dramatically and so thoroughly. And this is one of those ones with a social level leading to basic kind of cognitive ideas or structures or schemas or whatever, assumptions we can call them, can really alter your how you organize what you do mentally. And that is true of scientists.
Mm,
And scientists need to be careful to own their own assumptions.
right.
Most scientists, left to just their own, they assume kind of a mechanistic or a formistic approach. And a formistic approach, kind of everything comes down to just naming things, sort of like personality theory. There's this kind, there's that kind, there's this kind, there's that kind. That's fine, but it doesn't tell you what to do with them.
Mm,
Or an extension of that into a more mechanistic model. There's this kind and that kind, all these parts, but they fit together in particular ways in these relations and forces, just like a wind-up toy or a clock, just makes things happen.
mm,
Well, that's good too, and you can do a lot with that set of assumptions. But what about things where um, there's a complex system and there's many, many different ways to evolve, to partition it? And our ways of speaking do so, but they're culturally embedded. Well, pragmatism has a different idea about what truth is. It basically says, let's look at what works, what is helpful to it. In other words, use language as a tool. You worry about pragmatism because it could seem just like anything that works for me is great. So if you're going to use it scientifically, you have to say what your goals are. Well, functional contextualism is a wing that said, okay, let's assume that there's one world that all fits together, but when we partition it, we're organisms partitioning it. It doesn't have to be partitioned that way. It could be partitioned other ways, probably an infinite number of ways. So let's partition it in ways that help us accomplish our goals. And what the functional contextualists say is, well, what would be a good set of goals? Our goal is prediction and influence with precision, scope, and depth.
mhm,
Of what? Of the level analysis you're looking at for psychology. That's the whole organism interacting in and with the world, considered
mhm,
both historically and situationally. Well, when you do that, when you say, okay, we're just playing a game here, gang. We have this great tool that evolved, super cool, took over the world. We're awesome animals, man. We really have done a good job. Be really clear. If you're playing the prediction and influence game, be really clear, be cautious about whether or not your models are actually helping you then change things.
mm,
What difference would that make? Well, there are lots of wings of psychology that say, I'm just trying to understand it. What do you mean by understand it? I want to be able to predict it. I want to be able to describe it. Well, how about change it? Nah, if I really understand it, I'll be able to change it. The functional contextualists say, if we don't know how to change it, then we're not done yet.
mm,
And they also say, and by the way, this applies to me.
mm,
So even your own behavior is looked that way. It's kind of like an evolutionary perspective where it's evolution on purpose,
mm,
but you don't get a pass about being part of your evolutionary analysis. Think about it that way. I mean, evolutionary epistemology basically says we evolved to see things, we partition the world, but other organisms partition it differently. You don't sense magnetism. Some birds do. You don't sense electricity. Some eels do. You know, you have your particular channels. But what are you trying to do here? It really produces a kind of a humility, but also a practicality.
right.
And where if a concept sounds really cool, but it doesn't help you change anything, you kind of are not very interested in it. And if somebody said, well, what's really true, you're not very interested in that. What do you mean by really? Is answering that going to help us? What do you mean by help? I mean, being able to predict things and change things. No. Well, then, good luck. Hope you have a lot of fun over there.
Right.
Meanwhile, and because of that, we have avoided the cul-de-sacs. Let me give you an example of a cul-de-sac. In traditional cognitive science, there's endless interest in models that might someday be able to help us understand how the mind works. If you were to stop at any particular point and say, quick, can you show me what difference this would make in terms of human beings wanting to change their behavior, their lives? Often there's a long pause and then a statement, well, when we really understand it, we will. Okay, but I'm old enough to remember that some of that same folks in that same research tradition were saying that 20 years ago, 30 years ago, or 40 years ago. And at some point, you got to say, time's up. Can I give you an example? The DSM. Is the DSM making us better able to improve human lives? There's a lot of evidence that's making it worse. And there's almost no evidence that's making better. And the book itself says read the early pages. By the way, you can't use this to decide what treatment to use. It says it in black and white in the book. Well, then what the F is it for?
Right.
Because supposedly when we understand it, then we'll be able to do something about it. Dude, how many billions have been poured down that hole? Meanwhile, every kid walking around has a list of the 5 or 6 or 7 disorders they supposedly have. And sometimes that means massive amounts of medication.
Right.
1 out of 4 women were on antidepressants last year. Are you out of your mind? Do you know what high dose long-term use of antidepressants do to your sex drive? And by the way, it looks like it's lifelong. Really? That's our solution to happiness? No.
It's like the entire group of scientists are caught up in groupthink, specifically intellectualizing. The curse of the defense of intellectualizing is that you do so to delay responsibility. Right.
It becomes a life of itself. And then I sniff and I hear capitalist interests behind it. I'm not against capitalism, but come on. Sometimes there's motivated. I mean, for goodness sakes, we used to promote cigarettes on the idea that of its health benefits. You can look at the doctors in white robes smoking and the commercials that would say, and this really helps you relax and be, no, it kills you, dude. It kills you. And of course, they knew that decades before they allowed the public to know it. Right. So I'm not on an anti-medication rant. I'm on a, you asked about functional contextualism. Yeah. There's something really cool about the humility that comes that says, I'm only going to really speak loudly about things that I know help me both predict and change.
Right.
And if I can then put that into the human community,
right,
that's cool.
What function does the behavior serve?
Function.
In what context? Also very important to determine. So one of the latest ACT papers that I read was in relation to it being integrated, of course, and couched within the framework of process-based therapy, which is within it is the extended evolutionary meta model or EEM. First, I wanted us to touch on what is meant by process for you, because for me, I don't know if you've read any of my stuff, but I've been influenced by Alfred North Whitehead. It's the idea that humans are not composed of isolated static entities, but by interrelated dynamic processes that are continuously changing and relating to each other in different ways. And I guess I'm curious, is there any relationship there?
There certainly is. And actually, you will find in some of our best thinkers kind of echoes of where we are right now. The thing that's different about where we're at now, I think we have the analytic tools and the methodological ability to feed that kind of dynamical system evolving perspective in a way that is actually scientifically progressive. And so I spend hours every week working with the data team on how to develop new forms of statistical analysis that allow us to do that one person or one couple at a time, and then scale to the larger community. Because one reason why, and you asked for a definition of process, I'll loop back, but one reason why we haven't been able to focus on process very well is that processes can't be well understood or well seen inside an arbitrary collection. And so let me answer what process means and then explains why that's true and why the world has changed with AI and our ability now to collect data in a different way. What I mean by processes goes back to a Latin word that means a sequence. It's right in the word parade or procession. It means the sequence of events. Excuse me. The sequence of events that lead from one state to another. And what we mean by processes of change are the ones that are known to be helpful or hurtful in the evolution of a whole system. And we want ones that are progressive, sometimes or that open to processes that are progressive. Sometimes something has to happen here before something else can happen there. That are dynamic. These are double-headed arrows. They don't have to be linear in how they relate. Are theoretically understood. You have to be able to name what the processes are to be able to measure them, target them, change them. Are contextually bound. That's a really important one, because if you're playing the game of prediction and influence, in other words, saying where things are going and being able to change it if you need to, which is what the world wants from science, basically, usually, or from psychology, certainly.
Right.
If you're going to play that game, well, you got to be able to change things. And I can't change your behavior, but I can change the context of your behavior. I can do it chemically with medications. I can do it socially through talk and other forms. So, but I'm outside of you. I'm in your context, right? So if it's not contextually modifiable, well, then it can't also influence. It could predict. You can have things that predict, but you can't change. Okay, but that's a different game than a game we're playing here. Well, so theoretically describe sequences of change events that are contextually bound, modifiable, dynamic, and progressive. And the way that when you have several of those that you need to understand them is just how they all interlink. And there isn't any other way to do that other than in systems perspective, in a dynamical system, because they're not billiard balls anymore. They're more like spider webs or a whole big pile of pickup sticks or something. You move one thing, you move everything.
Non-linear.
Good. They're non-linear. They're dynamic. So some are linear, but the whole network is not linear. Some of the processes may be linear. You can have linear processes, but they could be sine waves. They could be upside down U's. They could be anything, right? So back to the implication of this, to why this matters.
Right.
I've been on this process-based journey my whole life, but I really got focused on it in my work with Stefan Hoffman and expanding out. If you take something like acceptance, that's an emotionally focused process and act, learning how to receive the gift of emotion and sensation and take what's useful, leave the rest. Yeah, but when you expand it out, emotional rigidity can include not just that, it can include emotional clinging. Hanging on to happiness is a form of rigidity. Running away from sadness is a form of rigidity.
Right.
So, and we've developed measures of that, and we've seen that. So when you look at what's inside classical ACT, we did a study looking at all the mediators of change ever done in the history of the planet, any psychological intervention for any mental health problem. We looked at 55,000 studies 3 times, well, twice, and then sometimes 3. It took us 3 years to do it, 50 people to do it, and we were able to come up with a summary. And 55% of all the things that are functionally important pathways of change were inside traditional psychological flexibility.
Mhm.
Well, but that leaves the other 45%. So what was the other 45%? Your relationships and culture, the therapeutic lines, things like that. Things having to do with your body and brain. And then concepts that will fit into a flexibility model if you expand it a little bit,
Mhm.
like reappraisal, which is really a form of cognitive flexibility, non-attachment, a form of emotional flexibility.
Mhm.
So when we went back and did that, it turned out we could account for basically every known processes of change inside what we're calling the extended evolutionary meta model.
Mhm.
And the thing I was beginning to get to, but I'll just make as a statement and you can guide me as to how deep we go on it, is that we've discovered that you cannot measure and analyze processes adequately inside a collective because collectives don't engage in the processes.
Mhm.
Particular people or couples or families do.
Mhm.
And so our bell curves and standard deviations, which are between person variability, don't tell you about the within person variability or within couple or whatever the unit
Yeah.
is that
Yeah.
predicts whether or not your life's going up or down.
Mhm.
And not only do they not do that, when you try to make them do that, they distort the individual or the particular person or
Mhm.
particular unit massively. So, like multi-level modeling, we've now discovered and shown, we have ways of showing it, massively distort the individual trajectories they claim to model.
Mhm.
Massively.
Mhm.
So, it's led us to a very geeky thing that I probably don't want to do a deep dive into, but let me just say it this way. We're going to enter into a world where if you have a process focus, and you should, you're going to have to be very interested in what picks you up or lifts you down as an individual or as a particular couple or family. And our generalizations, our broad statements, are going to have to be derived from that
Mhm.
without distorting that. So every voice matters. Nobody is an error term.
Mhm.
And we discovered that about 4 years ago.
Mhm.
And now we've developed new data analytic tools,
Mhm.
and we're able to do some of this dynamical modeling that
Mhm.
people have been talking about for a long, long time.
Mhm.
And what we see makes our jaws drop every week because it's completely different. I mean, the only metaphor I can use is like
Right.
probably what happened when people had a microscope and could first time see that there are microscopic creatures in water.
Mhm.
And you just go like, oh my goodness, there's life forms in there.
Right.
We're in this oh my goodness phase of realizing that all of our models have been fuzzing our ability to see human beings who
Right.
are particular human beings.
Yeah. So in a sense, it's incomplete. The previous models and even looking at processes are so difficult to do so accurately. And I think it's interesting because, at least from a whiteheadian perspective, right, processes are, in a sense, inherently counterintuitive or would be resistant against measurement because the very nature is to continue changing and complexity continues to increase. So every time you do measure something, it's a snapshot in time. But it's important to keep that in the context of your consideration of whatever variables you're looking
But
at.
if you get high density longitudinal data
Mm.
and the measures have some integrity to them, you can't just put them through traditional psychometrics because they are all right back to the collective.
Hmm.
All those consistencies or so forth are consistencies between people.
Hmm.
Even test retest, it's at and I come out of the metric tradition. I mean, my intellectual my grandfather was Alan Edwards from the Edwards Personality Inventory. My great grandfather developed the first infinite intelligence test. So I'm out of that tradition. But when you have now we're over to AI and what's happening technologically.
Mm.
Because if you have a sufficient data stream, you can start seeing some of these things. Let me just give you an example of where we may be going. That's beyond where we are, but not very far. We can already train models to detect processes of change in streams of verbal behavior. We can do it textually. We can do it simply by what you can easily do here inside the tech we're using right now. You can push a button and record the transcript. You can get AI to summarize the notes and tell us what we talked about, what the flow was. Yeah, we're actually training AI to be able to say what the processes are that are in that text stream. Imagine a universe in which you agree and have the privacy protections to do this, to allow everything that you say or hear in your entire day to be recorded here and put through an analytic model that is looking for known processes of change and allow that known to grow as we discover new things, and creating a dynamical model based on a day, a week, a month, a year, your entire freaking life. That's not science fiction.
Right. Yeah. It's very frightening. At the same time, it's exciting, just from a psychological curiosity perspective. But for many ethical reasons, that does sound somewhat.
Well, if you had the privacy protections, wait a minute. If you had the
Okay.
privacy protections and you yourself
Mm,
could be the one who had access to it, or others that you, by your free choice, gave access to it, maybe like your therapist, maybe
right.
it's distilled in particular ways, maybe the content couldn't be revealed, but the processes could.
Okay.
So if you're talking about sex with your wife, no, you won't be able to read that, but you can say whether or not, there was a bit of fusion going on here, or avoidance going on there, or
Mm,
values-based behavior going on there, perspective
mhm.
taking there, or,
Yeah.
you know,
That's interesting.
attentional shifts going on here, or attentional rigidity going on there. It doesn't have to be the train wreck of, the great all-seeing eye following you all the time. It could
Right.
be under your control.
Hmm.
And I've spent the last 4 years trying to build an ecosystem where this is possible.
Hmm.
And I've, I think, successfully built one. It's not yet, but involving for-profit, not-for-profit, a large data set controlled by world-class scientists with a moat and a chain link fence with barbed wire on the top around it to keep Google and Apple and the rest of the rest of the folks to keep their hands off the data set. So
Right. Yeah, I mean that would really push psychological science to the next level. So looking forward to seeing what happens, and I hope that potential flourishes the way it should. Um, so
well, we'll put a link in the stream, and if people want to check it out, the not-for-profit one that is developing the data with the Waldorf Sciences for Institute for Better Health, almost 50-year-old not-for-profit that I'm now president of and give money to and take not a nickel back.
mm,
And then we do have a for-profit one that allow you to give nudges and bumps based on what clients need.
mhm.
And why do I need that? Well, because I can show you the $2 million of federal grant money that I spent that only within 1 or 2 months became irrelevant because the tech changed.
I
So
see.
if you can't figure out a way to stay up on tech, you just can't do this vision.
Yeah.
But whether we do it this way with what I'm doing with PsychFlex and MindGrapher and Institute for Better Health, or somebody else does it, it's coming.
Hmm.
And I would rather have data that important and that world changing to be protected by a group of world class scientists who can allow
Hmm.
people to query it without grabbing it. Because
Hmm.
if you grab it and take it, you know what it's going to be used for? The $1.5 trillion industry of
Right.
big pharma,
Yeah,
or
absolutely.
funding your depression day at school,
Hmm.
because we know that once you get that label,
Mm.
they can sell even more medications. And
Sure.
so,
Well, yeah, Steve, send me those links, and I'll put them at the bottom of
sure.
our conversation. But I'd like us to pivot to some of these, I think, more juicy things for the audience.
Yeah.
Specifically,
Tolerated for 40 minutes of this.
oh, I can always edit things around, so that's the good thing. But
Good.
let's jump into this. One of the reasons why ACT is considered, third wave, uh, behavioral is because it relates to the shift in focus from the content or the form of a client's thoughts and feelings to the relationship, right?
Yeah.
And the process, as we've been talking about. So cognitive diffusion, for example, is considered a core sub-process, right?
Sure.
Now, the main idea, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that instead of identifying with a thought or an emotion and acting out, you learn how to notice or feel them for what they are as information and energy. The professor that used to say, emotions are energy in motion. I kind of like that.
Yeah.
And this allows you to follow through, right, by harnessing their potential in a useful way. So instead of being recruited by the emotion, you are recruiting the emotion in contrast, we could say. Now, why might it be more effective than cognitive reappraisal or the attempt to directly change maladaptive content and um,
Well, let me put this into an answer of a question you haven't asked yet, but I can do it really fast,
okay.
which is the overall psychological flexibility model that's underneath ACT.
Mm,
ACT came out and people became aware of it 20 years after it began because we spent so much time working on the processes, the measures, the components, the theory, the philosophy of science, relational frame theory, the wonderful things that you've been asking about. I can say it in a long sentence and I'll say it in a really short sentence. What life is asking you is to learn how to be more open to your thoughts and to your emotions, sensations, experiences, and memories in order to create more wisdom,
mm,
and then be able to bring it consciously into this present moment and allocate your attention in a flexible, fluid, and voluntary way towards the things that could allow you with your behavior to manifest the values or qualities of being and doing that you really want to manifest, building habits around that, and extending that to your relationships, your neighborhood, your culture, and taking care of your body. Drop a pin, that's the 98% of the known processes of change
mm,
is in that. Now I can say it in a short sentence. Learn to be more open, aware, and actively engaged in your life and extend that to your relationships and your body.
mm,
Drop a pin in that. So you asked about diffusion, and then you also brought in emotion, where I think acceptance is particularly relevant. So
mm,
let's just call it the openness pillar
okay.
that includes both diffusion and acceptance in classical ACT.
Mm,
But now I'm going to say it in the way that we say it in the extended evolutionary meta model. In that model, healthy variation that's selected and retained and fitted to context is the game. And you want to do it across all the dimensions that are relevant, and you
mhm,
want to do it at all the levels of complexity that are relevant, from your body to your culture and within your psychological life as a whole organism interacting and with this context.
mhm,
You want to do it across emotion, cognition, attention, sense of self, motivation, and overt behavior. And they're not hard and fast divisions. This is just between those things. This is
mhm,
just the openness pillar basically says in order for us to acquire more wisdom from our history, we have to be able to feel our emotions in a way that allow them to fulfill their evolutionary role, which is this kind of a signaling system. They're giving you information. And there is no emotion you can name that is bad.
mm,
You'll evaluate it as bad. If I said sad, you'd say bad. Yeah,
mhm,
but when your mother dies, you're not going to say sad bad.
mhm,
The fact that you're crying when your mother dies will be a sign of your psychological health.
right.
I mean, if I said fear, you'd say bad. Ride a roller coaster, dude. You're telling me there's no fear there?
Mm,
Do a bungee jump. What are you
mhm,
talking about? You're talking about the evaluation, right? How about thoughts? You're filled with thoughts that are contradictory, and your capacity, this is a relational frame thing, learn it in one, drive it in two, put it in networks. Your capacity, let's say just for 3-word sentences that would allow you to take what you know and go dink, 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 like noun, verb, maybe an adjective, and then some outcome. Well, that'd be a 4-word sentence, but short. When I do the math on that, anybody listening to me, you have enough words in your head to generate enough new thoughts, just defined that way, meaningful sentences, that are more than there are molecules in the universe.
mm,
So you're living on these tracks cognitively. Oh, there's something wrong with me. Nobody's going to love me. Whatever the thing is, deep down, I'm a bad person. I remember this horrible thing I did. I'm so ashamed. But whatever the thing is, and I'm not mocking it by saying it. I mean, I came into act through my own panic disorder, you know. But what diffusion suggests is let's find a way not to eliminate change or modify that as a way of diminishing its impact on you if it's negative, but to be able to notice it, learn from it if it's useful, and then allow it to serve an appropriate role in all the various kinds of things that you can do. In other words, is this thought particularly helpful to you? Mm-hmm. Suppose you had a thought like, you're unlovable. Sometimes you can even catch the person who first said something like that to you. Or you can slow it down and catch how young you were when you first had a thought like that. And when I do it in workshops and I hold my hand up and say, this is the average height of most of the people in this room, give me a nod when I hit the height when you first had a thought like that. And people start nodding at the height when people are like 3 or 4 years old. So what are you going to do when you have a history, given that there's no delete button that's healthy in your nervous system, short of brain injury, or as the joke goes, a bottle in front of me or a frontal lobotomy? There's not a healthy way to cut out. You can inhibit, you can restrict, but you're not wiping out parts of your brain that are involved. When would you want to? That remembers what it was like to be 4 or 5 years old and have your peers ridicule you, or have your mom say something that's really harsh, or if you have an abuse history, God help us. Yeah, okay, so you're going to go to your grave with that. You understand that, right? Yes. I mean, even little kids understand Goofy with horns on one shoulder and Goofy with a halo on the other.
Right, yeah.
All right, so you're going to go to your grave with that little argument in your head. Could we first take this step back and just notice it with a sense of equanimity? Not that you like it, but just notice it. Well, mindfulness training will help with that. And there's a sense of consciousness, the observer sense, this witnessing, noticing, pure awareness sense that evolved to help you do that.
And would you say that when diffusion becomes dissociation is when you're no longer aware of what you are actually looking at? Or
well, dissociation, I think, usually attaches to a part of fusion that comes over to the conceptualized self, where you start having a storied or narrative sense of self. And this integrated sense of self that normally emerges, and the continuity of consciousness then becomes an ally in being able to step back and notice mindfully. If you've had early trauma histories, really early ones, before that becomes well established, you can accidentally stumble into the simple fact that attacking the continuity of consciousness itself is soothing. If you've been raped when you were 3 or 4, boy, you could easily make that dissociative move. If a terrorist showed up and started firing bullets at you and I, and we didn't have that history, we probably wouldn't be able to find soothing inside dissociation. Because it's too ingrained to just be our conscious selves carrying all of our experiences. But it happens in early enough, you can attack the continuity of the consciousness before that full sense of self emerges that is like a table that will hold everything put on it. So I wouldn't say it's not just fusion makes dissociation more powerful for people who've had the history that allows them to have multiple personalities, or to really fundamentally undermine the sense of self as a way of emotionally regulating or surviving or just getting through a horrific experience. So it's related to fusion. But diffusion is that process of diminishing the behavior regulatory impact of relational framing, cognitive phenomena, such that you can be more open to the various thoughts that you have. Now, reason I went off to the larger definition and loop back is that you talked about it as reappraisal as fully distinct. But reappraisal, when it works, is different than diffusion and acceptance. It is, but is another form of cognitive flexibility.
Right. It works in the E model, right?
Yeah, and the old idea, if we go to the meta model, so we go from just diffusion to cognitive flexibility, just acceptance to emotional flexibility. That's the openness pillar.
Mm.
Attentional flexibility from this sense of self that is more flexible and perspective taking ability. That's the awareness pillar. Well, if we move in that direction, reappraisal has a place. Just don't think of it as detecting, challenging, and disputing your thoughts so that you change their form. Now, that's never how that worked.
Right.
It is what the theory said, it's how it worked, but look at the data. It's reappraisal is mediated by cognitive flexibility.
Mm.
It means being able to think in a way that's more open and free and flexible.
Right. So it's exploring different ways of thinking,
Yeah,
the variation, see if listening to some of the content would promote or enrich your life in some way, selection, and continue listening to the content retention when it's helpful.
exactly. So
Right.
the extended psychological flexibility model,
Mm.
I've got a huge summit coming up on this. Maybe we can put that in the notes, but if it comes up before it does. But extending that model allows us to have then in the cognitive flexibility domain a couple of processes that are different but are pals. They work out together, which is diffusion and reappraisal, understood as encouraging flexible thinking, in which you can do just like Tim Beck said, take what's useful.
Mm.
I mean, Tim, he didn't have a basic science of cognition. I mean, Tim was a friend, but the very first study done on ACT was done with the help of the Center for Cognitive Therapy in Philadelphia. My very first PhD student I sent to work with Tim Beck, before Tim Beck was Tim Beck. So that's how long my relationship is with him. But, you look at what he was saying, yeah, logically you get over into this idea you'll just get rid of the thoughts or diminish the thoughts, but no, that may make them more focused on, more important, more central. Given that we've got many, many different thoughts, we want to treat it more like you would treat salty water. If it's too salty, don't get out the tweezers and try to pull out the grains. Pour in more fresh water.
So by challenging the thoughts, you actually empower their
Empower
truth
them.
as they appear to you.
Yeah, but you could do it with some diffusion skills in a softer way. How is this helpful to you? It's
Right.
not helpful. Okay. Well, what else could you think?
Mm.
What else could you think? I mean, that's in early ACT protocols.
Mm-hmm.
So this isn't like brand new to us.
Right.
Write a story about your life. Now take all the facts, all the emotions, all the reactions, rewrite it with the same things in there. Now do it again.
Mm.
It wasn't to get to the true story. It was to see that you are storying. You're interacting with these thoughts. And they could be part of different life stories. Okay, so what story you want to rewrite now?
Right.
With this thought that says, and then my father abused me. That's not going away. We wouldn't want it to. We don't want to eliminate your history. I mean, we don't want to have that history. It's a crime. We want to change it so others don't. But no, you have the history you have. So, but how can you have it empower you rather than be like a ball and chain or a cage?
So, Stephen, in relation to what you're talking about, when I think about acceptance, sometimes what comes up in session, someone will ask me, or rather, let me ask you this: how would you distinguish between acceptance and acquiescing, or someone just giving up and yielding, in a sense?
If we take measures of acceptance, and there are a few out there, frankly,
Right.
especially from the East, because acceptance is out there in Eastern thinking.
Mm.
And if you look at some of the Chinese, Japanese, etc., work before ACT was sort of in there doing it a slightly different way.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of them were claiming to be measures of acceptance, but they were measures of tolerance, resignation, and acquiescence. It was just, the deities have decided, it's karma has done its thing, it is what it is, period, end of story. And acceptance is richer than that, because it's resignation is more, or acquiescence is kind of like more the putting up with what is.
Mm.
And in our philosophical traditions, there's another piece in there, which is to be able to learn from and benefit from what is.
Mm.
And let me give you an example. Can you think of any experience you've had that's painful? Any? That over your life, you haven't had moments where it was helpful to you, at least in informing you about what should never happen.
Mm-hmm.
You with me on this?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
I can't name one. Can you? I can't name one.
No.
And if you did, what you'd be saying is, here's a part of my life I want to just like take a scalpel to, cut it off, and I would be better. Well, wait a minute. You're saying basically then that there's something deeply wrong with you that has to be cut off before you can be whole and free. Can you slow down and notice how harmful a thought that is to you?
Mm.
Because you have no healthy way of cutting that off. So, the wiser wisdom traditions ask us to do this really hard thing, to learn how to forgive even ourselves, not to wipe it out. Good forms of forgiveness gives you what went before. It's right in the word, forgiving, gives you what went before, but in a way that doesn't produce ignorance.
Mm.
Have you ever had the thought of, man, if I could live my life over again, boy, I would have such a good time at school. I would have been able to take advantage of so many cool things. Yeah, dude, you're still alive. Have you noticed that?
And you're also saying that just because you've learned from those mistakes and challenges
Yeah.
faced. So it's in
Yeah.
that context.
So what
Yeah.
the mind does is it says, I want the wisdom without the experience. Good luck with that.
Yeah.
The only way we get that is through some forms of wisdom that come from our genetic history.
Mm.
And yeah, we're the social primates. And when kind eyes meet yours, within minutes of birth, you dump endorphins in your brain.
Mm.
Yeah, because you came into the world ready to be part of a group. And, your early imitative repertoire that's there within days of mouth opening, tongue thrusting, and smiling. Yeah, you want to be cute because you want to be connected and cute, because otherwise, why would you take care of these rugrats who are going to poop on your floor within minutes? I mean, you think about what we have to do to take this big skulled early, and be able to raise them to the point where they can stand and walk and care for themselves. It's just ridiculous how long we have to do that. So we've got to, mama's eyes meet yours. Mama's brain is dumping opiates too, right? That cuteness. My point being that there are forms of wisdom that just come from our evolutionary history.
Mm.
And if your felt sense can get you in touch with it, you can feel your yearning for belonging, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And you can feel just the way that you would settle into a warm bath of what it's like to meet the kind eyes of people who you love. And if you've been betrayed and you don't know how to deal with the wound that caused, you may do this stupid thing your mind tells you to do, which is, I will never be so vulnerable again after a betrayal. Almost everybody has a thought like that. Okay, slow it down. What your mind is saying is, because you yearn for intimacy and connection and belonging so deeply, and because you were so lifted up by what looked like love and intimacy but turned out to be a lie, you will never be able to experience that again, and you will take steps to make sure you don't. Because vulnerability, literally from the etymology, woundability, only happens when your heart is open and you're saying, I'm going to close my heart, never to open it again. Okay, great. I don't care how many people you screw, you're never going to have what you're yearning for.
Right.
A loving relationship includes vulnerability, because that person, even if they're true to you, may die tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
And you're going to suffer if they do. So an open heart means learning how to carry. So I'm back to what life is asking of us, is to take this analytic judgmental brain that gives us the problem-solving solution. I'll never be so vulnerable again. I'll just avoid all the possible risks. And your life gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller.
Mm-hmm.
We call that psychopathology. It's
Right.
not a disease. It's a human condition.
Mm.
And instead find a way to expand that territory so that you can live a life that's more whole and free, but you'll never be finished.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You're not broken. You don't need to be fixed, and you're never going to be finished, but you can be on a journey that has a slope up instead of one that has a slope down.
Right. Yeah. I was just going to point out that the example that you provided, when somebody does polarize to the other end and say, I'm going to shut myself down, I'm never going to experience that again. It's interesting because the paradox is that their decision is still completely based off of the perpetrator's actions. So they're still being just as controlled, even they're doing the exact opposite. So that's also another layer
It
to
is
consider.
so hard when you get into abuse and you get into
Yeah.
trauma,
Yeah.
because it sounds like forgiveness is letting the other person off the hook.
Mm.
Yes, in a sense, they go off the hook, but dude, the hook went through you first, and then the other person was put on it. So if you want to slide off it, you have to let them slide off it. But that does not mean that you don't hold them accountable. That does not mean that you don't take steps to correct it, such as file a legal complaint or otherwise. No, but the gift in forgiveness is to yourself.
Yeah.
It's giving you the experienced innocence to start again. So forgiveness is not ignorance. It's learning how to carry your history with its wisdom, including the kind of reads you need to stay away from people who are perpetrators. Do you know what? This is almost, oh, God, it makes you weep. The effect of early abuse often is alexithymia, not knowing what your emotions are, etc. What is one of the single biggest predictors of abuse as an adult? Alexithymia, not knowing what your emotions are.
Mm.
Why? You go home with unsafe people. You're not making the reads.
Mm.
You put yourself in. Now, this is not blaming the victim. I understand why people say that, but no, that's not true. When we're empowering people to be with their history, we're empowering people to have the wisdom so that they can take the actions,
Mm-hmm.
to do the hard things and talk about the family abuse to your mother, for example, who never heard that story or whatever, or to file that complaint, to step up to it, yeah? Or even confront a perpetrator if it's safe. But it also includes the ability to now love again, or to be open, to open your heart when you didn't know how to do anything else but close it down. And you did it as a form of protection. Or we were talking about diffusion and multiple personalities, and to be able to integrate your sense of self in such a way that you can carry the hell of your own history and the new things that are happening without having to dissociate or flip personalities or otherwise do things that are so emotionally dysregulate that I have to cut in order to even be able to be present with myself.
Right.
Yeah. So life is asking you something hard when you've had a difficult history of how to be wise, which means learning from it, which means contacting it, and be present, and be whole, and be free. But I think we have the tools. Maybe not all the tools, but if you look at all these mediators, all these processes of change, they can be fit in this simple sentence. Learn to be more open, aware, and actively engaged in a life worth living. Extend that to your relationships in your body. The fact that it be put in a simple sentence doesn't mean it's simple. This is a lifelong journey, and you'll never be perfect at it. But life is asking you to learn how to do this.
Mm-hmm.
And if you say no, 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 the question doesn't go away. And the new opportunities for learning that are being lost and the new opportunities for damage that are being experienced don't go away either.
Mm.
So if not now, when? And if not now, or not who, and if not you, who?
Right.
Tag. Your
Yeah.
life is your life. And I think the empowerment agenda that comes inside the third wave work, which is finding a way to take the wisdom traditions and these mindfulness traditions that were more focused on your relationship to your experience and not just the content of your experience, has now put evidence-based therapy and the wisdom traditions on the same page.
Mm.
And for the first time in human history ever, we're trying to bring analytic, experimental science, neuroscience, psychological science, so all the social and behavioral sciences, life sciences, to learning how to be whole and free,
Mm.
and really geeky stuff like idiomatic analysis and AI tools to tell you what's next and all that kind of
Mm.
stuff we were talking about here tell me that we're on a trajectory as a human community where it may really be possible that without the orgasmatron or filling yourself with chemicals constantly, all the science fantasy, fiction fantasies, that we'll be able to take our children, take ourselves, and walk them through a journey of development and exploration that will predict greater and greater freedom and greater wholeness.
There was a phrase, quote that you've mentioned in a clip a long time ago, and it really stuck with me. And I was just curious as to the origins and how you came up with it. It's a slight tangent from what we're talking about, but connected nonetheless. And specifically, I like using it with people who have bad habits or addictions, and that is, it may feel good, but does it live well? I found that to be immensely impactful, and
Yeah, yeah.
it's stuck with me for a while. Yeah. What are the origins to that? Could you share a bit?
Well, the feel goodism on the avoidance piece is, can we let go of feeling good and focus more on feeling good? But then there's the attachment piece,
Mm.
which is sometimes things feel good but don't live well because it isn't a matter that you're avoiding, it's the matter that you're attached to and grasping. And, you know, we see this in the addictions. They involve cognition, it's right in the word, diction, a diction, dictate, it means being spoken to.
Mm.
And so you're allowing your history to speak to you in the way like the Wizard of Oz, dictator within. There it is, the same Latin root,
Mm.
dictator, right? Yeah, but sometimes what's being dictated is I must have, or this is so cool that. Let me tell us a story that is probably shouldn't ever be said aloud, but I'll say it. I grew up in the hippy dippy world, and drug exploration was everywhere. And I was in a house of a actor or actress. I forget who it was, but it was somebody who was famous in the Hollywood Hills. And somebody was passing around an opium pipe, and I'd never ever been exposed to that chemical before. And I said, well, I guess everybody's doing it. I guess I'm going to do it. And I got home and I was talking to my wife at the time, my ex, one of my exes, and she said, "So, what was that experience like?" And I said, "I am never, ever, ever going to do that again." He said, "Why? Was it terrible?" I said, "No, I knew the first thought, the first puff, that feels good, but
Mm.
that will not live well. That
Mm.
will, you know, you could feel it like, oh my God, what's not to like about that?" Well, I'll tell you what's not like to like about that. Just look at opiate addicts and see what's not to like about that. It's an absolute freaking train wreck.
Mm.
Your life is going to be about chasing that.
Mm.
You really want that? No, I don't want that.
Mm.
And so just because something feels good doesn't mean that it lives well or that it's good for you. That attachment piece, be careful. And that could mean, the great sex you had with some beautiful person. It could mean the applause from people who you've convinced with your work,
Mm.
the likes you get on your Instagram page. I mean, in the modern world, we've given kids, these dopamine surges from freaking playing video games.
Mm.
And yeah, we're down now to the average attention span on the internet is 47 seconds.
Mm.
That's how long you last before you click to something else. 47 seconds.
Okay.
Just 5 years later, earlier ago, it was something like 2 minutes.
Mhm.
But 2 minutes is already ridiculous.
Mhm.
So joy junkies, feel good junkies. There's two forms, and you can play it both ways. Yeah, learn how to feel
Mhm.
well. That's the avoidance piece. And be careful about feeling good as the only guide, because it can easily take you into
Right.
corners that are life cul-de-sacs easily.
Yeah. The hedonic treadmill can be a dangerous one to stay on for too long. And I mean, from a neuropsych perspective, right, you have ancient systems that have been designed for a particular purpose to reinforce particular behaviors, and these substances can
Exactly.
be hijacking them. But in any case, that thank you for sharing that origin story.
Yeah, that probably get me in
It
trouble
was pretty
someday. Steve
good.
Gates was an
Uh,
opiate addict. No, just a hippie. Tried it once and said no, no.
so Steve, moving from that, one of the reasons, of course, you said, you look at the opium addicts, and you look at other individuals who've been addictive and hit rock bottom, and clearly they've moved, uh, or steered or diverged from their path of values. And values, of course, are very important in ACT, defined
Yeah.
as life directions, meaningful qualities of being or doing. Let me ask you this first question, and that is, do you think we choose our values, or do you think we discover them, or both?
Well, it's both. And the metaphor of discovering sort of says the values are already there. We take the cover off, right? Discover, and then you see it. I mean, there are certain features of the human condition that you can discover. And
Mhm.
I mentioned some earlier where the social primates, belonging is important to us. But if somebody wants to say, look, I want to be a hermit, I want to explore space in which I'm going to see what it's like to be me without any social interaction at all, other than whoever shoves the food underneath the door, the door of my cave, because I'm doing this spiritual work. That's cool.
Mm,
I mean, who are we to say, no, 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 you shouldn't be a hermit. We're a social primate. Dude,
mm,
I mean, people have done, the impact of hermitage has often come because occasionally they come out and say a few things.
mm,
But even if they don't, they represent something. And why is that so? Why are people giving alms to people? I mean, well, because we sense sometimes that there's a space in there that we may be able to explore, but it's difficult to explore in the day-to-day, workaday world where we're being pulled into social impression management. Look at me, a smile becomes a rictus. Uh, well, values, the thing that's cool about them is we have all these kind of motivators that we've evolved to have. Some of those, because of social changes, we now have easy access to. That's just too damn easy. Yeah, sugar, salt, etc. I mean, salt licks are important to animals for a reason.
mm,
They'll travel many, 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 many miles to get there to lick that salt. Sugar is, a high caloric food, and it's really cool to be able to sense that this is something. Or fatty foods, etc. You know, and you don't want to be able to take 10 steps and have sugar and fat in unlimited quantities and live in the modern world. You better be careful about that, because you're going to die an early death. You're going to hurt your body. We didn't evolve for an environment in which you could have 24/7 access to unlimited amount of fat and sugar, as an example of the larger issue. Well, then what is going to guide your behavior when this thin cortical overlay has solved so many problems that the rest of creation is dealing with, but now given us all these psychological problems? But also this other issue of, well, then what is life about? What are we up to? I mean, can I just say it this way? What if, well, how about this? Do you know it really is possible within even my lifetime? And dude, I'm 76 years old, that I'll have 2 or 3 robots who just work for me and do anything I ask it to do? That's science fiction.
mm.
It is possible
Yeah.
within my lifetime. Never mind yours. I'm 76 freaking years old. What are you going to do when there's a billion robots? What are you going to do? If what you've been aspiring to, etc., be careful. So what we need, what the wisdom traditions help us find at their best, is not just the mindfulness skills to take on the whole of our history and bring it into the present moment. That's great. But every single one of those traditions then say, and what about right action? What about wise choices? How do you put not just self-compassion, but compassion towards others in your life? How do you put caring?
Mm.
How do you put caring for the suffering of others into your life? And so um, what values work does is takes those flexibility skills that you've developed, brings you in this present moment, and asks you a question of what are the intrinsic qualities that you want to reflect in your behavior? Not just what are the goals. You can have goals on the way to doing that. I want to be helping others who are suffering. Okay, how are you going to do that? I'll be a therapist. Okay, how are you going to do that? I got to go to school. Okay, how are you going to do that? I had to get good grades, and I got to get a degree, and then I get this other degree, and then I'll get a certificate, and it'll be okay, great. That's a goal.
Mhm.
But when you have that certificate on your wall, I've got one on my wall somewhere. It says now I can do that. That's not doing that. That's just a certificate on the wall. That was a goal. It was done, finished. I got my degree. I got my license, right?
In a sense, it's a difference between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation.
Exactly. Exactly. And the extrinsics are fine. They're wonderful to keep things going. And yeah, I want to make enough money, et cetera, and all that. But can I work through how to make this choice? But it better be informed by the whole of you,
Mhm.
which will require taking the cover off so that you can even see some of the things that are important to you.
Mhm.
And some of those will be out of the painful things that have happened. I not only want to be a therapist, I want to work on alcoholism. Why? Well, my dad was an alcoholic, and yeah, of course. Or I used to have this thing yeah, of course. I mean, there's a reason why Marshall Linehan developed DBT and changed the world. You can see it on her arm.
Mm.
The scars are still there.
Right.
Yeah.
Mm.
Well, that's taken the wisdom of your history and
Mhm.
allowing you to make these intrinsic choices. So empowering intrinsic choices that are informed by discovery, but
Mhm.
not just turned over to that.
Mhm.
I'm not going to just turn over my choices. Guys, the capacity to choose among events with reasons if I have them, but that's just part of the whole of me. So they don't have to be for reasons. They don't have to be justified by because, and then the story is tells. You need the wisdom you had when you were a kid and you would say, just cause. Why did you do that? Just cause. Values are like that. Just
Mhm.
cause.
Mhm.
This is of importance to me.
Interesting.
And when you own that,
Yeah.
you now have an inexhaustible form of motivation, number one.
Yeah.
And your life journey is your life journey.
Mhm.
And that's feels vital and true. And you wake up. You wake up. Why? Just because when you're on your life journey, it feels as though things are at stake here that are at stake. It can change. Nobody's making you stay on that journey. You can change your journeys, but be on a journey that's one that is worthy of your capacity, the privilege of being a human being.
Mm.
We have a capacity for environmental change and social transformation, personal transformation that is so awesome
Mhm.
that it's a crime to not learn how to put our mind on a leash, take the whole of us, and make those kind of choices that can better the world.
Mhm. Yeah. I'm in a complete agreement with you in regards to that, and the approach of acted self has helped so many individuals achieve that capacity to potentiate those dormant abilities, we might say. That it's been a real blessing to have you around. Now, Steve, because of the time, I want to be mindful. I know that you're a busy man and you have stuff to do after this. So I'd like to just ask you a few more questions. I'd like you
Probably
to.
only have time for one. I've got about 6 minutes before I have to do a hard
Okay,
stop.
so why don't we just skip over all of these questions I thought of, and just go to the rapid fire questions because that's what we like to
All
do
right,
on
great.
this one.
You have a tradition.
Okay, yeah. All right. So first question for you is name a book you love.
Evolution for everyone.
Okay. Do you have a favorite philosopher?
Favorite,
Philosopher.
Stephen Pepper.
What type of music do you really enjoy?
Trance.
Hmm. Share two potent phases or quotes that you like.
Quotes that I like?
Yeah, just two.
Oh, golly. Um, let me take a pass and I'll come back.
Okay. All right. What's something about yourself that most people don't know?
Um, I really enjoy football, basketball, and uh, Wolfpack sports. I root for my home team. I'm a big time sports person.
Okay. Do you believe in God?
Say it again.
Do you believe in God?
I believe there may be a higher power in the sense of some large, and I don't believe in an old man with a beard, but I do believe in spirituality and in other dimensions. And so I am a committed agnostic that lives his life as an atheist who prays and values spirituality.
Okay. Okay. Um, is our universe meaningless or meaningful?
I believe that it's meaningless, except that we are the creatures for whom meaning is an act of creation that is central to our humanity. So we create meaningfulness. It doesn't batter its way in.
Hmm. Okay. And this last one can have a bit of a longer response if you'd like. What purpose, if any, exists for humans? Or what is the purpose of human life?
I think the purpose is to show up to your capacity to be whole and free.
Hmm.
And in a way, I think you could say it this way. Part of your purpose is to discover how to have peace of mind with purpose
Hmm. Okay.
and to own it. We're back to meaningfulness.
Right. Right.
To
Thank you
just
so much.
stare into the void and to spit into it and say, stop me if you can.
Mm-hmm. Did you want to go back to those quotes or?
Yeah, two quotes.
Yeah.
Oh, golly. I feel so inadequate because there's so many people that I love, and I'm sort of feeling as though. Um,
It could also be your own personal quotes, things that you've said
well,
before.
my single favorite is love isn't everything; it's the only thing, and
Mm.
it came out of a quote that I hated, which is "Winning isn't everything; it's the only thing." I
Uh,
thought it was one of the most loathsome quotes on the planet,
mhm.
and at one moment in my life, saw that I could transform it, and it's become my motto. If you want to put it on my gravestone, that would be awesome. Love isn't everything, it's the only thing.
Excellent. All right. Amazing. Thank you, Steve, for joining me here. It's been such a pleasure. Would love to have you back on board. I still have a whole bunch of questions. We didn't even get to touch on the consciousness stuff.
Yeah, that would be awesome. Awesome, awesome. And I loved your questions. I loved the deep dive. And
Awesome.
I hope some of the folks listening were left lifted up and benefited, but I certainly enjoyed the ride and appreciate deeply the depth of your thought about what you were asking me to look at.
Well, thank you, Steve. Thank you. Okay. You take care.
Peace, love, and life. Ciao.